Hi there. My name is Goradia. I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner on the non-dual path. Today, I want to share a revolutionary way of looking at emotions, and I give full credit to this to my teacher, Ryan, who I had an amazing conversation with this week. And we're always diving into the somatic material through a spiritual lens. And then I also get to ask him his experience after he's cleared so much and he's awakened, he's fully liberated. And his experience of emotions is far different than most people's. So he experiences an oceanic flow of emotions throughout the body, as opposed to what most of us experience, which is a cutting up of sensations by the mind into fear, sadness, all of these different things. And so I want to break this down a bit because I think this information can really free someone. So when we are looking through the lens of our traumas, the mind, what it does is it projects labels and just meaning making, all sorts of stories, all sorts of information onto our physical experience. Our physical experience, however, as sensations, doesn't have a particular message or meaning at the absolute level. I know relatively it can inform some information, intuition, maybe a past trauma, and we have a memory associated with it. So I'm not saying to throw all of that out. However, at an absolute level, you can, it depends where you're at in your journey, but if you're ready for this, you can start to look at these sensations in a very arbitrary way. A great example Ryan gives is, can you write a story with sensations? We can't, right? Because they don't have inherent meaning. They don't have intrinsic meaning. When we have a sensation, it doesn't have a word on it, right? So the meaning we're giving is from a mental projection. And when you recognize that, that is one way you can free yourself from this reinforcing cycle in which believing thoughts that are not true create real-time emotional experiences, usually unpleasant ones if we're believing a false thought that is psychologically negative. So it fuels this emotion, which is uncomfortable, feels really bad. And then this sensation gives this apparent truth to the thought because we think, well, it must be true because I feel so strongly about it. But that is actually circular logic. Do you see that? I have a thought, I buy into it, I feel a sensation, and then I use that sensation to say, see, the thought was true. But really, the thought is the cause. It originated it. So the event that happens downstream cannot be proof of the validity of the thought. It can be proof that the thought was there and it was believed, but it cannot prove the validity of a thought. I can say, oh my gosh, the moon is made of cheese. Oh my gosh. And that scares me and I feel fear. And that fear doesn't mean, yes, the moon is made of cheese, right? So you can see that very easily with something as ridiculous as that. It goes for everything. So that's different from intuition, which I've covered in another video. Emotions can be probability indicators, but what we're talking about is through this spiritual lens. So if I'm looking at these emotions and they're showing up as sensations in my body, what is the difference between an emotion and a sensation if you want to really dissect it down to understand? And it's really cool because this distinction can free you. So an emotion is basically when we have a mental attachment to sensation cycles in our bodies. So what do I mean by sensation cycles? Well, our experiences are these somatic sensations in the body, our direct experience. And if you notice, they're always changing. Particles are arising and disappearing into and out of space. And our experiences, they're always changing at some level. even if we have chronic pain, it can still be a different frequency, a different length of time each day, a different intensity. So we want to look at this. And it's very easy to see with acute sensations. If I feel sadness, I might feel some, heaviness in my chest, and I might feel it move up to my throat and the lump, and I might cry, and then I get some relief, and it's a little bit less. And then the next day it's probably gone, right? And so these sensations, they're appearing and disappearing in cycles. And it's not that they're consistent cycles, but what I mean is that they're impermanent. they're coming and going. It's not a static, fixed entity. So when you see that these are sensation cycles, and then the mind projects meaning or a label onto it, this is hopelessness, okay? And maybe it does feel like that, okay? But when I'm attached to a story about hopelessness, and this is nobody's fault, no one's meaning to do this, no one's trying to do this, but see how this works, and then see if you have some tools now where you can start to detach from the story, because that story of hopelessness, what it does is it keeps my mind attached to the sensation, seeing an arbitrary physical experience of a sensation coming and going in different frequencies and intensities, lengths of time in my body, and not creating any meaning and not having any attachment to it. Then if I did that, if I didn't have any meaning or attachment to it, it would actually just move in a flash. So emotions get stuck when we have mental resistance, aversion, fear, stories, attachments. That's what gets these emotions stuck. Without all this, it just comes off my body, usually in 10 seconds or so. And so when we have the story attached to an emotional label, so we have this mental attachment, then it feels like something more tangible and real and permanent, but it's not. It's an attachment to the story that's fueling the emotion, right? And so when I have this attachment to a cycle, something that's coming and going, I'm only noticing when it's here, and I have a story about it, and I get really fixated on this sensation. Whereas if it was something like a sensation of my shirt on my skin, I'm not even going to notice it, right? And I understand emotions are more intense than this, but when we start to view them as arbitrary, as the sensation of my shirt on my skin, and I can only do that by putting the story to the side momentarily, then it can just pass through. And I understand this is difficult. This is just something to work on as able, aspire to kind of see where the end game is with this, because Ryan's gone all the way. If you go all the way, your mind is no longer projecting these cookie cutter sort of pieces of emotions. He experiences this ocean, and it's quite pleasant because it's not having a projected label of some sort of negativity, and there's no attachment to an experience either. And so it's always flowing. So for an emotion to exist, it needs to have some kind of duration. But if there's no attachment, then there's nothing fixating it in the body, and it doesn't have duration. It just flashes through. And that's why his experience is so oceanic. And I've experienced this as well in the times where I've gone into non-dual. It's very apparent that these emotions, that there's not a problem. When I'm in non-dual, I see no reason to even do the work, because there's no judgment of the emotion. There's no problem with it. Even I've had hours of feeling a sad sensation while in non-dual. I did nothing with it. I was just so blissed out, even though I felt that sensation of sadness, that there was no resistance to it. It did not take away from my happiness whatsoever. There was no aversion, so I didn't even do any clearing or SE or anything. And so I can see what he's saying. That's constant experience. And so I just want to also validate that I have experienced that. So I know in my direct experience that that's true, what he's saying. And I invite you to check in your direct experience. So think about how the mental attachment towards a sensation can be causing the emotion. There's also a physical component to attachments, and that is very interesting. I will make future videos in far more depth about attachments, but what I will say about the body level attachment is that there's usually a primary sensation that is involved with this whole attachment. So say like I am feeling lonely, and then I think I must be married to not feel lonely, right? And then so I have this mental attachment to marriage, right? And then because I'm not married, then I feel, oh my gosh, like all of this angst in my body, right? And that angst might be the primary feeling I'm feeling, but then there's a secondary feeling at the body level, a somatic secondary reaction. And what that does is it's afraid of this first feeling, because none of us were really taught how to be with our feelings, hold space for them. Most of us weren't co-regulated with, because our parents' generation wasn't taught this, and so on. So there's this inherent fear. Part of it's from this old conditioning of not knowing what to do, not having space, but part of it is actually built into the body. The body is made to fear certain emotions so that we stay alive if we're afraid of dying. And if certain emotions make us feel like we're going to die, because there's a snake, I see a snake and I feel like I'm going to die, and then I run out of the way. Well, that is a great mechanism in a real life situation, an acute stress situation with a snake. So that's how emotions are designed. But in PTSD, they're getting stuck, right? And it's not a real-time situation. And so what we want to do is start looking at like, okay, so I feel the primary sensation, but then there's this reflex. And this is not simply mental resistance. This is built into the body's survival. So you can think of this. So in PT school, my first job was physical therapy. We learned about the gate theory of pain, where I might have a sensation receptor or a pain receptor that is getting stimulated, and then it'll take this information to my spinal cord, and then there will be a synapse here, and it will have an efferent motor neuron that will come back out here, and it will cause a reflex. Okay, so I get put my hand on the fire, and then I go like this. Now, that didn't go to the brain. There was no neural input from the brain for that reflex. That's one example of this automatic secondary reaction. So a lot of what we're doing in SC is we're clearing the secondary reaction of fear so that we can finally feel the primary feeling. And I want to talk about both of these things in this video, because if you look at this in terms of attachments, it's really incredible when you break down attachments. It's like, okay, so I need to see through this illusion I have, right? So see through the mental aspect of this attachment. Oh, I believe I'm lonely because I'm not married, right? Okay, wait a minute. If I really see through this, I can't be separate. And if you've had enough direct experiences of this too, it's like you prove it to yourself. Like, I can't be separate. I'm infinite consciousness. And then when I'm abiding in that awareness, and then you feel the bliss of that, and then you feel that, oh, my true nature is self-fulfilling and content. That's the nature of it. You don't feel any need. You don't feel any desire. So you have an experience, so you have enough of that, and you can see through that mental attachment. And then the secondary component of this is seeing through the physical aspect, the physical aspect of attachments, okay? Because again, if I buy into the delusion, and then I create the emotion and the angst, and then I'm afraid of it. Well, that's going to cause it to get saved and stored in my body as a saved pattern, that when I have more space and resources later, I can then hold space for it and allow it to come up. But it can only release if I've seen through these two attachments, the mental attachment and the physical attachment. So with the physical attachment, you start noticing, oh, there's this fear reflex that keeps coming up. And when you do enough of this, you're no longer afraid of your soma, of your physical body sensation. And you want to try to feel through the primary feeling. And whatever it is, you can feel it through, allow it to come up. Maybe it's sadness, maybe it's fear. As you do that, you're freeing the somatic pattern. And you need to do this by seeing through the mental attachment to the story. You got to see through it and then put it aside. If you keep buying into it, this isn't going to release. Buying into it is exactly what locks it in. You got to see through the initial thing that caused all this to get saved. And you have to have the courage to feel through in your body. Feel it. It's not going to hurt you. And you can do, physical resourcing techniques. I'll link that here to increase your capacity to feel, increase your container. If it's something big, do this with support. Do this with a practitioner. Do this with a friend. Make sure you got a good night's sleep the night before. Make sure you're as resourced as possible. That's going to widen the container as much as possible. And so that's what's going to allow space for more difficult and older emotions to arise. And when they come up, see them with compassion and don't create a story about them while they're coming up. It's going to lock them right back in. So let the stuff kind of come off of you so you can be lighter. So remember, when these sensations are arising, if you think of them as arbitrary, you're going to have the best result. And they are. I know they came for a certain reason at a certain time in your life when you were younger, but you were oftentimes believing a story. Now, I'm not saying the facts of what happened didn't happen. They happened. But then we might have believed a story that the facts of what happened meant that I wasn't good enough. That's the story. The story is not true. These things that happen have nothing to do with our worth. And so when you have the sensation and you treat it just like a rash, like a physical thing, and you don't ask, where did this rash come from? Why me? What does it mean about me? You don't ask anything. You don't add a story and more attachments to it. And so you view the emotions like this. It's just arising. It's just here. You look at it as neutrally as you can. You'll get the best result if you know who you are. I'll link a video to that here, because then when you know who you are, you don't have any stories left. It's the highest vantage point perspective through which you can look at the world. So this is a different way of looking at emotion that is not kind of in this therapy sort of compartmentalized way of looking at emotions. It's expanding the viewpoint, expanding the attention in a way that the attention is more open, diffuse, like a non-dual attention, non-dual awareness. And when you're doing that, the ocean of emotion is just flowing much more freely, and we're not in the narrow, more tunnel visioned, forward projecting mental activity, which is then going to compartmentalize and cut up emotions, have a story about them, and not be able to see the larger picture. It's like the horse with kind of the blinders on each side. So I hope this was of some help, and that this can help in relieving some suffering. You can see how much I'm smiling right now. I can attest to this working, and then the freedom that comes with this. I hope you try it. Feel free to ask questions below, and I'll see you next time.